Konnichiwa. In this video, we're going to learn how to form the polite forms of verbs. Okay, so I'm going to take Tobira Sensei's place for just a sec. So if you haven't already learned about the 3 different categories of Japanese verbs, you should go watch the video about that first. So we need to know which category a verb is in order to conjugate it into the polite forms, but the base form of all the polite forms for all 3 of these categories ends in mas. So we'll also sometimes refer to these as the mas forms, just because they all have that same base. Now, we learn polite forms first, but if you're used to watching or reading a lot of Japanese media, these aren't the forms that you'll probably be hearing. Like in anime and manga, you hear a lot of different casual forms, which are different from the ones we'll be studying. The reason we study the polite forms first is because they're polite, right? So they're never going to come across as rude. If you learn the casual forms first that you often hear in anime and manga, in some circumstances, it's not appropriate to use those forms, right? Whereas using the polite forms is never going to get you in trouble. So that's why we learn those first. So that's just a little bit of a warning. Try not to copy everything you hear in anime and manga necessarily, because it might end up not being quite polite enough, depending on the circumstances. Okay, so depending on the different categories, we'll have different conjugations for the polite forms from their dictionary forms. But first we'll look at the irregular verbs. And as their name suggests, the conjugations are irregular. So unfortunately, you just have to memorize these. But fortunately, there's only 2 of them, so it's not a lot to memorize, right? So the verb suru, to do, becomes shimasu in its polite form, right? Suru, shimasu. Kuru becomes kimasu. So we just need to memorize shimasu, kimasu for those 2 verbs, to do and to come, right? For do verbs, the rule is really simple. It works for all of the do verbs. So you just drop the do at the end and add mas, right? So for instance, neru, to go to sleep or to sleep, nemasu. That's it. So that's all you have to do. Neru, nemasu. Or okiru, right? Same idea. Drop ru, add mas, okimasu, to wake up, right? So do verbs, really simple. Drop ru, add mas. Now our final category, u verbs, is a little bit more complicated because of how the Japanese writing systems work. So we just drop the final u sound and add imasu, an imasu sound, right? So if we look at, for instance, the verb to listen to, kiku, first we just chop off that u sound and add imasu. Kiku, kikimasu, kikimasu, right? So we'll notice that this changes the hiragana character here. It changes kind of our stem before mas. Kiku, kikimasu. So one more example would be nomu, right? Chop off the u, add imasu, nomimasu, nomimasu. And again, we change from mu to mi here, right? So it's hard to see from the Japanese writing system that all you're doing is just dropping the u sound and adding imasu. It kind of makes it hard to depict without showing that in romanization, just chopping off the letters there. So one way you might find it easier to think about it is if you're thinking about the hiragana chart. And basically we're moving around, we're moving up and down the chart in the same consonant row, or same consonant column, depending on the conjugation. So all of the dictionary form endings will be in this u row. And then all of the endings before mas in the polite form will be in the i row, right? So an example of this, right? We have kau. So we're looking at the u row here. All we do to make the mas form is we move up in the same column to the i row. So move up, ka imasu, ka u, ka imasu, right? So if it's more helpful for you to think of it that way, that's also fine to do. So one more example, right? Kaeru, even though it ends in ru, it's an u verb, right? So we're looking at this rarirurero row. Our dictionary form ends in an u sound, kaeru. We move up to the i row for the mas form stem. So kaerimasu, kaeru, kaerimasu, right? Remember, this is only for u verbs that end in ru. We don't have to do any of this for regular do verbs, right? We just drop ru and add mas. So taberu, tabemasu, right? Okay, so those are the rules for making the mas forms for each of the three categories of verbs. So that is the base polite form, right? But we can also conjugate that form for polarity. So in other words, for a negative sentence, or an affirmative sentence, I do something, versus a negative sentence, I don't do something, right? And this is really easy. Once you have the mas form, it's the same for all the different categories. You don't have to worry about categories anymore. When you have the mas form, that's the affirmative form, right? So if we want to say, I wake up, 私は起きます. And it'll be assumed that the topic is you if you're talking about it, so you can just say 起きます. 私は起きます. To change that into a negative, I don't get up, we just change ます to ません. 私は起きません. Right? 起きます, 起きません. So just change ます to ません. And this isn't a do verb, but this works for any type of verb. So for 行きます to go, that's an u verb, 行きません. Right? For します, in a regular verb to do, しません. So we don't have to worry about categories once we've got the mas form. We just change mas to ません for negative. Right? Now, tense-wise, mas, ません. These polite forms are what is known as the non-past tense. So there's no separate present and future tenses in Japanese. So this mas form can be used for either present or future situations. So when you're going to use this is like in English for, so for instance, 私は見ます. I watch, right? So what can this mean? Like in English, this can be used for habitual actions. I watch it every week. 私は見ます. Can also be used for future actions. I will watch it. 私は見ます. It's fine, right? What it can't be used for is continuing actions. So in English, we would say, I am watching it. We need a different form, am watching, right, for the present continuous. In Japanese, there's also a different form for the present continuous. So we can't use it this mas form if we mean it's going on right now. And we'll learn the separate form for that later in the textbook. Okay, so that is how you conjugate and use the mas polite forms of verbs. So that's all for this lesson. Until next time, じゃあまた.